Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. They say every town has its secrets, but mine has a warning system. The first time I heard them, 3 summers ago, I thought it was just cicadas. Maybe a particularly large swarm passing through Cedar Mills, Colorado. But cicadas don't sound like that. They don't arrive in perfect synchronization, humming with an almost mechanical precision. And they definitely don't show up 3 days before someone dies. If you're still listening, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another small-town ghost story. This is happening right now, in towns across America, and nobody's talking about it. The question is, are you brave enough to hear the truth? Because once you know what to listen for, you'll never unhear it again. And the story begins now. I moved to Cedar Mills in the spring of 2021, fresh out of my divorce, looking for the kind of quiet that only a town of 800 people could offer. The realtor, Mrs. Henderson, had shown me this perfect little craftsman on Maple Street. Best neighbors you could ask for, she'd said, gesturing to the house next door. The Johnsons have lived here 40 years. Salt of the earth people. I should have noticed how her smile faltered when she said it. How her eyes darted to their perfectly manicured lawn, then quickly away. That first night in my new home. I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the absolute silence. No traffic, no sirens, just the occasional bark of a dog and the whisper of wind through the massive oak trees lining the street. It was exactly what I'd wanted. 3 months passed in peaceful monotony. I'd wave to Mr. Johnson every morning as he retrieved his newspaper. His wife Sarah would bring over fresh-baked cookies every Sunday. "Welcome wagon never stops," she'd joke, though by the 3rd month, I suspected she was just lonely. Then came the night of July 15th. I woke at exactly 3:17 a.m. to a sound I'd never heard before. It started low, almost below the range of human hearing, a thrumming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I lay there, heart pounding, and trying to identify it, not quite mechanical, but too regular to be natural. The sound grew, layer upon layer adding to the chorus, and that's when I realized what it reminded me of. Locusts, thousands of them, but wrong somehow. Their rhythm too perfect, too synchronized. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through the blinds. The street looked normal, empty, but the sound was getting louder. Then I saw them. At first, just shadows moving across the streetlight. Then more. A cloud of something descending on the Johnson house. In the pale yellow glow, I could make out individual shapes. Insects, definitely, but larger than any locust I'd seen. Each one the size of my thumb, with wings that caught the light like oil on water. They covered the Johnson house completely. Every surface, every window, the entire roof, a living, breathing blanket of synchronized humming. And then, as suddenly as they'd arrived, they lifted. The entire swarm rose as one, twisted in the air like smoke, and vanished into the night. The silence that followed was deafening. I didn't sleep the rest of that night, kept telling myself I'd dreamed it, stress from the move, maybe, or something I ate, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The next morning, Mr. Johnson waved from his driveway like always. Everything seemed normal. I almost convinced myself to forget about it. Almost. 2 days later, I was heading out for my morning run when I saw the ambulance in the Johnsons' driveway. No sirens, no urgency. Just the quiet efficiency of professionals who knew there was no rush. Mrs. Patterson from across the street was standing on her lawn, arms crossed, shaking her head. "Heart attack," she told me when I approached. Right there in his easy chair. Sarah found him when she brought his morning coffee. I mumbled something appropriate, but my mind was racing. 3 days. The locusts had come exactly 3 days before. 78 years old, Mrs. Patterson continued. I suppose it was his time. But what if it wasn't just his time? What if something had marked him? I tried to forget about the locusts, threw myself into fixing up the house, starting my new job at the hardware store downtown. But small towns have a way of revealing their patterns if you pay attention. 6 weeks after Mr. Johnson's death, I was closing up the store when Dale, my coworker, mentioned something odd. "You hear that humming last night?" he asked, counting the register. Woke Cheryl and me up around 3. Strangest thing. My blood went cold. Humming? Yeah, like a massive swarm of something. But when I looked outside, nothing there. Cheryl thinks I dreamed it, but I know what I heard. "Where do you live?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "Over on Pine." "Why?" Pine Street was 4 blocks from me. "Just curious. I've been hearing weird stuff at night, too. This town's full of strange sounds." Dale laughed. "Tell me about it. Though, between you and me, I'd rather deal with weird sounds than what happened to the Johnsons. That kind of thing makes you think about your own mortality, you know?" I knew exactly what he meant, though not in the way he thought. 3 days later, the news spread through town like wildfire. Mrs. Chen, who ran the Chinese restaurant on Pine Street, had passed away in her sleep. Stroke, they said. She was only 53. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything. The dates, the deaths, and most importantly, the sightings. Because I wasn't the only one who'd seen them. At the hardware store, customers would mention it in passing. Always indirect, always uncertain. Strangest thing happened last night. Or, you wouldn't believe what I thought I saw. But when I pressed for details, they'd clam up, change the subject, look at me like I was crossing some unspoken boundary. But I kept listening, kept track. October brought 2 more deaths, each preceded by reports of humming, of shadows moving in impossible patterns, of people waking at 3:17 a.m. to sounds they couldn't explain. The first was Tommy Martinez, 16 years old. Car accident on Route 89. His mother said he'd been complaining about nightmares for 3 days before, dreams of being covered in crawling things. The second was Eleanor Walsh, the librarian, found at the bottom of her stairs. Broke her neck in the fall. Her neighbor mentioned seeing a cloud of bugs or something around her house 3 nights prior, but assumed it was just a trick of the light. The pattern was undeniable now. The locust came 3 days before someone died. Always at 3:17 a.m., always in perfect synchronization. And always, they marked their target with absolute precision. But why? And more importantly, how did they know? I started researching. Spending hours in the library Eleanor had once run, looking for historical records, newspaper archives, anything that might explain what was happening. That's when I found the first mention. A newspaper clipping from 1947, Strange Insect Swarm Puzzles Residents. The article described a cloud of unusual locusts appearing in town, followed by a series of unexpected deaths. The reporter noted the insects' peculiar synchronized behavior and their tendency to gather at specific houses. I found more. 1963, 1978, 1991. Every 15 to 20 years. The same phenomenon, the same pattern. And always, the town forgot. Moved on. Explained it away, but I couldn't explain away what I'd seen. What I continued to see. Because the locusts kept coming. By December, I'd identified the rules. Or at least, what I thought were the rules. First, the locusts only came for people whose death was somehow Inevitable? That seemed like the wrong word, but I couldn't think of a better one. Mr. Johnson's heart had been bad for years. Mrs. Chen had high blood pressure she never managed properly. Tommy had been drinking at that party before he drove. Eleanor had that vertigo condition she never told anyone about. Second, they always arrived at 3:17 a.m., never 3:16, never 3:18, always precisely 3:17. Third, once marked, the person had exactly 72 hours, no more, no less. But knowing the rules didn't make it easier. If anything, it made it worse, and because now, every night, I'd lie awake listening, waiting, dreading the sound that meant someone in my town had been marked for death. 2 days before Christmas, I heard them again. This time, I was ready, camera in hand. I crept outside. The winter air bit at my exposed skin, but I barely noticed. The humming was coming from 2 streets over, Oak Avenue. I ran, slippers slapping against the frozen pavement, turned the corner just in time to see them. The swarm, massive and undulating, covering a 2-story colonial I recognized, the Brennan House. I raised my camera, but my hands were shaking too badly. The locusts moved like liquid shadow, their bodies catching what little light came from the street lamps. Through the viewfinder, I could see details I'd missed before. Their wings weren't just iridescent. They had patterns, symbols almost, like nothing I'd seen in any insect guide. And their eyes, God, their eyes, they glowed, soft and golden, thousands of tiny lights in the darkness. I managed 3 photos before they rose. The swarm twisted upward, forming shapes in the air. For just a moment, I could have sworn they formed a face, ancient, knowing. Then they scattered to the wind and were gone. My photos showed nothing but darkness. The camera couldn't capture what I'd seen. Or maybe it refused to. 3 days later, on Christmas morning, Jim Brennan had a brain aneurysm while opening presents with his grandchildren. He was dead before the paramedics arrived. The town mourned, said things like, "At least he went quickly," and surrounded by family. But I knew the truth. He'd been marked. They'd all been marked. And I was starting to understand why everyone pretended not to see. Because what could you do if you knew you had 3 days? What would change? Would you tell your family, say goodbye, try to run, or would you just wait? I got my answer on New Year's Eve. I was at the town's annual celebration in the community center, trying to pretend everything was normal, trying to forget the 7 deaths I'd documented since July. That's when I overheard Margaret Willis talking to her daughter. "I saw them," she was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 nights ago, just like Mama used to describe." Her daughter was trying to shush her, but Margaret continued, "I'm not afraid, honey. I'm 93 years old. I've had a good life." Our eyes met across the room. In that moment, I saw she knew exactly what was coming, and she was at peace with it. Margaret Willis died at 11:47 p.m. on January 2nd. Peacefully, in her sleep. But not everyone accepted their fate so easily. By February, I'd documented 12 deaths, all preceded by the locusts, all following the pattern. But something was changing. The sightings were becoming more frequent, the swarms larger. And then came the night they came for someone I knew. February 18th, 3:17 a.m. The humming woke me as usual, but this time it was different. Louder, closer, too close. I rolled out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and peered through the window. My blood turned to ice. The swarm was next door, but not at the Johnson house, which had been empty since Sarah moved to live with her daughter. They were covering the house on the other side, Katie Morrison's house. Katie was 28. taught 3rd grade at the elementary school, baked the best chocolate chip cookies in town, and volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. She was healthy, happy, had her whole life ahead of her. This had to be a mistake. Without thinking, I burst out my front door. The winter air shocked my lungs, but I didn't care. I ran to her house, waving my arms at the swarm. "Get away from her," I screamed. "She's not sick. She's not dying. Get away." The locusts turned to me as one. Thousands of golden eyes fixed on my face. The humming changed, became almost questioning. For a moment, just a moment, I thought they might listen. Then they resumed their coverage of Katie's house. Dismissing me entirely, I pounded on her door until she answered, bleary-eyed and confused in her pajamas. "Mrs. Davies, what's wrong?" I looked back. The locusts were gone. Of course they were. I thought I saw someone in your yard." I lied. I was worried. She smiled, that kind teacher smile. "That's sweet of you to check, but I'm fine. You should get back to bed. You look freezing." 3 days? She had 3 days, and there was nothing I could do. I spent those days in agony, watching her go about her life, teaching her classes, walking her dog, having dinner with her boyfriend, all while the clock ticked down. I tried to warn her, subtle hints about being careful, suggestions she see a doctor, get a checkup, but how do you tell someone they're going to die without sounding insane? On the 3rd day, I called in sick to work, sat by my window, waiting. Sunset came and went. 8 o'clock, 9, 10. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the pattern was breaking, maybe. At 10:47 p.m., sirens filled the air. I watched from my porch as they loaded Katie into the ambulance. Allergic reaction. I heard later something in the new tea she'd tried. Her throat had closed up. If her boyfriend hadn't been there, hadn't called 911 immediately. But he had been there, and she survived. The locusts had been wrong. Or had they? That night, I couldn't sleep. Something fundamental had shifted. The rules I thought I understood were incomplete. The locusts marked death. Yes, but death wasn't always inevitable. Which meant what? They marked potential death? Probable death? Death that would occur without intervention? I was still puzzling it out when I heard it. 3:17 a.m. The humming. But this time, it wasn't passing by. This time, it was all around me. I lay perfectly still as the sound grew. Through my bedroom window, I could see them gathering, covering my roof, my walls, crawling across the glass. The humming penetrated everything, filled my bones, my blood, my thoughts. And in that sound, I heard something impossible. Words. Not English, not any language I recognized. But somehow I understood. 3 days, they said. You have 3 days. The swarm lifted, departed, left me gasping in the sudden silence. I sat up, turned on every light in the house, checked my body for symptoms. Nothing. I felt fine. Healthy, normal. But the locusts had marked me, and they were never wrong. Even with Katie, they hadn't been wrong. She would have died without intervention, which meant I had 3 days to figure out how I was going to die, and how to stop it. I made lists, every possible danger, every risk, car accident. I wouldn't drive, fall down the stairs, I'd stay on one floor, heart attack. I was 35 and healthy, but I'd go to the ER at the first sign of chest pain. But as the hours ticked by, I realized the futility. Death has 1,000 faces, 1,000,000 ways to claim you. How could I guard against them all? By the second day, paranoia had set in. I tested every bite of food, checked every step before I took it, jumped at every sound. I'd become a prisoner in my own home, afraid of everything and nothing. On the morning of the third day, exhausted and defeated, I made a decision. If I was going to die, I wouldn't spend my last hours cowering. I'd face it head on. I went to work, said hello to Dale, helped customers find what they needed, had lunch at the diner, acted like it was any other day. As evening approached, I found myself oddly calm. I'd done what I could, whatever was coming. I'd meet it with dignity. I was walking home from work, taking the long way through the park. When it happened, a dog, some kind of retriever mix, came bounding toward me. Friendly, tail wagging. I knelt to pet it, and that's when I noticed the owner running after it. "I'm so sorry," she called. "He slipped his leash." I stood, smiled, told her it was fine. Started to walk away. The dog barked. I turned back, saw it straining toward the woods, whining. "That's weird," the owner said. "He never acts like this." Something made me follow the dog's gaze. There, barely visible in the underbrush, was a shape. Small, moving, a child. I ran, crashed through the bushes. I found a boy, maybe 6 years old, lost, crying, hypothermic. He'd wandered away from his family hours ago, drawn by something he'd seen in the woods. The ambulance said 10 more minutes and he might not have made it as they loaded him up. His mother crying, thanking me over and over. I realized something. The locusts hadn't marked me for death. They'd marked me to prevent one. That night, I waited. 317 came and went, no humming, no swarm, just silence. But I knew they'd be back. They always came back, because death always comes back. And now I understood their true purpose. They weren't harbingers of doom. They were part of something older. Something that existed in the space between fate and free will. Between what must be and what might be. The locusts mark the moments when death hovers close, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a summons, and sometimes, just sometimes, as a call to action. I still live in Cedar Mills, still hear them some nights, a familiar humming at 3:17 a.m., but I don't fear them anymore. I understand them. And if you're still listening, if you've made it this far, let me ask you something. Have you ever woken at 3:17 a.m. for no reason, heard a sound you couldn't quite place, felt the weight of eyes watching from the darkness? Pay attention next time. Listen carefully, because the locusts are everywhere, in every town, marking the moments when death draws near. Most people choose not to see, not to hear. It's easier that way. But now you know. And once you know, you can never unknow. So tell me, what will you do the next time you hear them coming? Will you hide under your covers and pretend they're not there? Or will you listen to what they're trying to tell you? Because sometimes, knowing death is coming is the only way to stop it. And sometimes, the person they're coming to save might be you. The next morning, something had changed in Cedar Mills. People looked at me differently, nodded knowingly, and slowly, carefully, they began to share their stories. Mrs. Patterson pulled me aside at the grocery store. My grandmother saw them too, she whispered. Back in '63, she saved 3 people that year. The locusts kept coming to her, showing her who needed help. Dale caught me after work. I lied before, he admitted, about not seeing anything. I've seen them 4 times now, each time. Someone in my family was about to make a terrible decision. The locusts, they don't just mark death, they mark turning points. Even the new family who'd moved into the Johnson house had a story. They'd lived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania before. Same phenomenon, different name. We called them the Knowing Swarm. The father told me, every place has them. They just adapt, take the form people expect. But the most shocking revelation came from Sarah Johnson herself. She called me one evening in March, asked if I could meet her at the diner. When I arrived, she was sitting in a back booth, coffee growing cold in front of her. "I need to tell someone," she said without preamble. "About Harold. About what really happened." I sat down, waited. The locusts came for him, yes, but they'd come before. Many times. She pulled out a worn notebook. He kept track, just like you do, for 40 years. He documented every swarm, every death, every save. She slid the notebook across to me. Inside, hundreds of entries, dates, times, names, patterns within patterns. "He figured out something you haven't yet," Sarah continued. "The locusts don't just mark random deaths. They mark deaths that matter. Deaths that ripple outward, change things." I flipped through pages, saw the connections. A businessman who died before he could close a factory, saving hundreds of jobs. A teacher whose death inspired her students to become doctors. A drunk driver who died before he could hit a school bus. "Harold's death," I began, "brought you here." Sarah finished. "You needed that house. This town needed you. How many has it been now? 3 saves? 4? Actually, it was 7. But I hadn't told anyone. The locusts pick their watchers carefully, she said. 1 per generation. Usually, someone who can see them, understand them, act on what they show. But why Harold, if he was a watcher? Sarah smiled sadly. Because his work was done, and yours was beginning. The locusts knew, they always know. She left me with the notebook. 4 decades of careful documentation. Proof that Cedar Mills had always been protected, watched over, guided by someone who could see what others couldn't, or wouldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from understanding. The weight of what I'd inherited, what I'd become. At 3:17 a.m., they came again. But this time was different. They didn't cover a house. Instead, they formed a column outside my window, spinning slowly, deliberately, and in their motion, I saw images, flashes of possibility, a gas leak at the elementary school, a bridge collapse on Route 89, a fire at the nursing home. Not prophecies, potentials, things that might happen if no one acted. The swarm dispersed, but the message was clear. My role had evolved. I wasn't just an observer anymore, I was a guardian. The next day, I made anonymous calls, gas company to check the school, Department of Transportation about the bridge, fire marshal about the nursing home's old wiring. They found problems at all 3 locations. Word spreads in small towns, even unspoken words. People began coming to me with their concerns. Dreams that felt too real, feelings they couldn't shake, instincts that screamed danger. I learned to translate their fears into action. Anonymous tips, gentle suggestions, coincidental encounters that changed plans, altered routes, saved lives. The locusts came less frequently now, but when they did, I paid attention, learned their language of movement and sound, discovered that the humming had variations, tones that indicated urgency, patterns that suggested types of danger. Some nights, they'd show me things I couldn't prevent, deaths that were necessary, part of some larger pattern I couldn't see. Those were the hardest. Knowing someone would die and being unable to act. But I learned that even watchers had limits. By summer, I'd mapped the network, found others like me in neighboring towns. We didn't meet, didn't talk, but we knew of each other, felt the connections in the swarm's movements, saw how our town's fates intertwined. The locusts weren't random. They were a system, ancient, purposeful. maintaining some balance between fate and chaos, between what must happen and what could be changed. But knowing this brought new questions. Who sent them? What intelligence guided their perfect timing? And why did they choose to appear as locusts? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen's daughter, Lisa, visited in August. She'd been researching her mother's death, found my blog posts about unusual phenomena, put the pieces together. In Chinese tradition, she told me, locusts are symbols of change, destruction that leads to renewal, death that brings transformation. She showed me her mother's journal, written in Mandarin, but Lisa translated. Her mother had seen the locusts too, many times, but in her entries, she called them something else. The Adjustment Bureau, Lisa translated, smiling at the mundane name. She said they weren't creatures, they were mechanisms, part of reality's error correction system. According to Mrs. Chen, every possible future created threads. Some threads led to catastrophe, others to harmony. The locusts appeared at junction points, where a single death, or survival, could shift the entire pattern. She wasn't afraid when they came for her, Lisa said. She wrote that her thread had run its course, that her death would push 3 people onto better paths, including me. Lisa had become a doctor after her mother's death, and specialized in stroke prevention, had already saved dozens of lives. The pattern held, but patterns, I was learning, could be changed. September brought the largest swarm I'd ever seen, not covering a house, but filling the entire sky, blotting out stars. The humming so loud it woke the entire town. This time, everyone saw them. No one could pretend otherwise. They formed words in the sky, not English, the same ancient language, but somehow everyone understood. Choose. Then they showed us 2 futures in one. Cedar Mills thrived, families grew. Children played safely in streets watched over by those who could see danger coming. In the other, darkness, empty houses. A town slowly dying as people moved away, fled from tragedies that could have been prevented. The message was clear. Accept the Watchers. Accept the system. Or lose everything. The town chose that night, not in words, but in understanding. The pretense dropped. People began talking openly about the locusts, sharing their experiences working together. We created networks. Phone trees for when the humming started. Check-in systems for marked houses. Support groups for those who'd lost someone despite our efforts. Cedar Mills became something unique. A town that looked death in the eye and said, not today, not if we can help it. But we also learned acceptance, that some deaths were doors that needed to open. Some endings were beginnings in disguise. The locusts taught us the difference. I still live here, still wake at 3:17 when they come. But now I'm not alone. We have 12 watchers now, different ages, different backgrounds, all chosen by the swarm, all carrying the responsibility, and we've spread the word carefully, quietly, to those ready to hear. Because Cedar Mills isn't special. Every town has its swarms, its watchers, its patterns. Most people just choose not to see, but you've seen now, heard the truth, and that changes things. So let me ask you one more time. When you wake at 3:17, when you hear that sound that shouldn't exist, when you see shadows moving in impossible ways, will you pull the covers over your head, or will you become what your town needs? The locusts are waiting for your answer. And trust me, they're very patient, but they won't wait forever. Sweet dreams. And remember, if you wake at 3:17 tonight, listen carefully. The locusts might have something to tell you. But then again, maybe it's better if you don't. Unless, of course, you're ready to join us. Leave a comment below if you've ever experienced something you couldn't explain. And subscribe if you want to hear more true stories from towns that harbor impossible secrets. Because Cedar Mills isn't the only place where the ordinary masks the extraordinary. The locusts taught me that. And now, they've taught you too. The only question left is, what will you do with the knowledge? Story number 2. The first time I heard it, I was spreading peanut butter on toast at 2:47 a.m. The melody was so faint, I almost convinced myself it was coming from the Johnsons' apartment next door. But when I pressed my ear against the cool metal surface of my refrigerator, there it was. A tune I'd never heard before. Sweet, melancholic, and somehow familiar. If you're listening to this in bed right now, maybe pause and listen to your own appliances for a second. Do they sound normal to you? Are you sure? Now, let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story really begins. I moved into apartment 4B on Maple Street in Burlington, Vermont, 3 weeks after my divorce was finalized. The place came partially furnished, which was perfect because Sarah had taken most of our stuff. The refrigerator was already there, a Kenmore Elite, stainless steel, probably 10 years old but in decent shape. The landlord, Mr. Petrosky, mentioned something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly. Said she was a music teacher at the local elementary school. Nice lady, quiet, paid rent on time. The first few nights were adjustment nights. You know how it is in a new place. Every creak sounds like an intruder. Every shadow looks wrong. But the refrigerator, that was different. It started on my 4th night there. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it. Not the usual electrical hum, but something else underneath it. Like someone humming along to a song playing very, very quietly. I got up, padded to the kitchen in my bare feet. The linoleum was cold. October in Vermont always catches you off guard. As I got closer to the fridge, the sound became clearer. It was definitely a melody. Not random noise, not the compressor acting up. An actual tune with rhythm and purpose. I opened the fridge door. The humming stopped immediately, replaced by the normal whir of the fan. My leftover Chinese takeout stared back at me. A half-empty bottle of Sam Adams. Some questionable lettuce I should probably throw out. Nothing unusual. I closed the door, waited. After about 30 seconds, the humming returned. Different tune this time. Lower, sadder somehow. Great, I muttered to myself. Divorced, alone, and now I'm losing my mind. But I wasn't losing my mind. I recorded it on my phone. The audio was faint but unmistakable. When I played it back, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Because the melody, even though I'd never heard it before, made me think of Sarah. Of the way she used to hum while cooking Sunday breakfast. Of better times. The next morning, I called Mr. Petrosky. Hey, weird question about the fridge. It's working, right? His voice was gruff, impatient. I just had it serviced 6 months ago. No, it's working fine. It's just, does it make any unusual sounds? There was a pause. Long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. What kind of sounds? His voice was different now, careful. Like humming? Another pause. I'll send someone to look at it, he said quickly, this week, maybe Thursday. He hung up before I could respond. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a notebook and my phone, documenting everything. The humming started at exactly 11:17 p.m. I wrote down the time, tried to capture the melody in my terrible musical notation. It went on for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. Then silence for exactly 5 minutes. Then a new tune. By 2 a.m., I had documented 17 different melodies. None repeated. Each one made me feel something. Nostalgia for moments I'd never lived. Homesickness for places I'd never been. And underneath it all, a growing certainty that these weren't random songs. They were messages. The next few nights followed the same pattern. I'd wait in the kitchen, notebook ready, trying to decode what I was hearing. I even downloaded a music theory app, began teaching myself the basics. The melodies were complex, layered in ways that shouldn't be possible from a simple hum. Sometimes I'd hear harmonies, like multiple voices singing together, though it was clearly just one. On night 7, something changed. I dozed off at the kitchen table, my head on my folded arms. The humming woke me, but this time it was different. Louder, more insistent. And it wasn't coming from the refrigerator, it was coming from inside it. I jerked awake, heart pounding. The kitchen was dark except for the thin line of light escaping from the fridge seal. As I watched, that light pulsed in rhythm with the melody. I stood up slowly, chair scraping against the floor. The humming continued. I reached for the door handle, hesitated. What if opening it made it stop forever? What if I was about to lose this strange, beautiful mystery? But curiosity won. I pulled open the door. The light blazed brighter than it should have. For a moment, I was blind. Then my eyes adjusted and I saw nothing unusual. Same leftover Chinese. Same beer, same wilted lettuce. But the humming was louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere. And there, stuck to the inside wall with a magnet I didn't recognize, was a note. Handwritten. Musical notation I couldn't read yet, and below it, in careful cursive, for the next lonely soul, AF. I took the note with shaking hands. The moment I did, the humming stopped. The light returned to normal, just a refrigerator again. I spent the rest of the night trying to decode the notation. It was beyond my beginner's understanding, but I could tell it was beautiful. Complex, like someone had transcribed an emotion into musical form. A.F. Ann Fitzgerald, the previous tenant? I had to know more. I didn't sleep much over the next few days. Instead, I researched. The internet is a wonderful and terrible thing when you're trying to solve a mystery at 3 a.m. I found forums about haunted appliances, which, yes, apparently that's a thing. Most of it was nonsense. People claiming their toasters were possessed. Microwaves receiving signals from aliens, but buried in a thread from 2018, I found something that made my hands go cold. My refrigerator in Burlington started humming songs after I moved in. Beautiful melodies I'd never heard. Landlord wouldn't do anything about it. I recorded hundreds of them before I finally moved out. Still have the file somewhere. Melody Ann, 47. Burlington. Just like me. I private messaged the account. No response. The user hadn't been active in 2 years, but I kept digging. Found another post from someone in Boston. Then one from Portland, Maine, always the same pattern. Old refrigerator, mysterious melodies, tenant who lived alone. The posts went back years, scattered across different forums, different cities, but always in New England, always in October or November. I started mapping them. Got a cork board from Walmart. Felt like a conspiracy theorist, but I needed to see the pattern. Red pins for confirmed cases, blue for maybes. By the end of the week, I had 17 pins clustered around Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. There was something else, too. In 3 cases, I found obituaries. The tenants had died. All of natural causes, all found days later. All alone. That's when I started leaving my apartment door unlocked at night, just in case. I didn't want to end up as another red pin on someone else's board. Meanwhile, the refrigerator kept singing. I started recognizing patterns. Happy, upbeat tunes between 6 and 8 p.m., dinner time. Lullabies after midnight. And sometimes, just sometimes, I'd hear something that sounded like crying set to music. Those were the worst. I developed a routine. Work my remote job during the day. Customer service for a tech company, which meant I could do it from anywhere. Evening, walks around the neighborhood, trying to tire myself out. Then back to the apartment for my nightly concerts. The neighbors must have thought I was losing it. Mrs. Johnson from 4. A knocked on my door one evening. "Everything all right, dear?" She was holding a casserole dish, tuna noodle from the smell. "I've seen your lights on awfully late." "Just adjusting to the new place," I said, accepting the dish. "Thank you for this." She peered past me into the apartment. "You know, Anne used to keep odd hours too, sweet woman. Very dedicated to her music." "You knew her?" "Oh, yes. We'd chat in the hallway sometimes. She was always humming." I said it helped her think. Mrs. Johnson's eyes got distant. The last few weeks, though, the humming was different. Sadder. Like she was trying to work something out but couldn't find the right notes. After she left, I ate the casserole standing in front of the refrigerator, listening to its songs. Mrs. Johnson was right. Some melodies did sound like questions without answers, musical equations that didn't quite balance. I started keeping detailed logs. Time, duration, my best attempt at musical notation, and what I was feeling when I heard each song. Because that was the strangest part, the melodies seemed to respond to my emotional state. When I was angry about the divorce, the songs turned sharp, discordant. When I felt nostalgic, they became wistful, full of major sevenths and suspended fourths, terms I was learning from YouTube videos at 2 a.m. One night, I tried an experiment. I put on Sarah's favorite album, the one she used to play while cooking, Bon Iver. Skinny Love started playing through my phone speaker. The refrigerator's humming stopped completely, just cut off mid-note. The silence was so sudden it felt loud. Then, after about 10 seconds, a new melody began. It was Skinny Love, but wrong. Minor where it should be major. Slow where it should be quick, like someone had taken the song's soul and turned it inside out. I turned off the music. The fridge continued its twisted version for another minute, then went back to its usual repertoire. "You can hear what I'm playing," I said aloud. "You're listening to me as much as I'm listening to you." The response was a soft, ascending melody, almost like a question. "Yes?" On Thursday, the repair guy showed up. Jake from Burlington Appliance Repair. Young guy, probably mid-20s, with a Red Sox cap and paint-stained jeans. "Mr. Petrosky said you got a noisy fridge." I led him to the kitchen. Of course, it was completely silent. "It usually starts around 11 p.m., I explained, feeling foolish. "It's not like a mechanical sound, it's melodic." Jake gave me the look, the one that says another crazy tenant. But he opened his toolkit anyway, pulled the fridge away from the wall. I watched him check the compressor, the fan, the coils, everything normal. "When did you move in?" he asked, pushing the fridge back into place. 3 weeks ago." "Huh?" He was writing something on his clipboard. "And it started right away?" "Few days after, yeah." He put his pen down. Looked at me, really looked at me. "Can I give you some advice, off the record?" I nodded. "Maybe get a white noise machine, play it loud, and..." He glanced at the fridge, then back at me. "Maybe don't listen too close to what it's humming. Some things are better left alone." "You've heard it before, other apartments." He didn't deny it, just started packing up his tools. "Look," he said finally. "I've been doing this for 8 years, seen maybe a dozen units like this. Always the same model fridge, always in old buildings, always..." He paused. "Always people living alone. And sometimes they get too into it, you know, start hearing things that maybe aren't meant for them." "What do you mean, not meant for them?" Jake zipped up his toolkit. "My grandmother used to say that music was how the dead talk to the living. Said some people were just tuned to that frequency. Maybe that's bull. But I've seen enough to know that when a fridge starts singing, it's usually singing for someone." "For who?" He shrugged. "That's the question, isn't it? Maybe it's not singing for you at all. Maybe you're just intercepting someone else's message." He left without charging me. That night, I ignored his advice completely. I set up my phone on a tripod, started recording at 11 p.m. I wanted video evidence this time. 17 p.m. came and went. Silence. 11:30. Nothing. Midnight. Still nothing. I was about to give up when I realized it was waiting for me to stop paying attention. So I pretended to, turned off the camera, made myself a sandwich, acted normal. That's when it started. Not humming this time. Singing. Actual words, so faint I could barely make them out. A woman's voice, sweet and sad. Silver moon and autumn sky. Watch the lonely years go by. In this cold and empty home, I sing for those who lie alone. I fumbled for my phone, but the moment I moved, it stopped. Just the regular hum again. I stood there, peanut butter sandwich forgotten in my hand, trying to process what I'd heard. Because that voice, I knew that voice. Not personally, but I'd heard it before. Where? When? Then it hit me. The elementary school. I'd gone there for a job fair last week. They'd had memorial photos in the lobby, teachers who'd passed. And one of them, I grabbed my laptop, searched for Burlington Elementary staff, found the memorial page. And there she was, Anne Fitzgerald, music teacher, died 2019. She looked kind in her photo. The kind of teacher kids would remember fondly. The kind who'd hum while grading papers. The kind who'd lived in apartment 4B. I became obsessed, not in a healthy way, I know that now. But when you live alone, when you've got nothing but time and questions, obsession fills the empty spaces. I found Anne Fitzgerald's obituary online. Died peacefully in her sleep, it said. Natural causes. She was 53, no family listed. Just a note about donations to the music program at Burlington Elementary. But I dug deeper. Found her Facebook page, still active in that ghostly way abandoned profiles are. Her last post was from October 2019, 2 weeks before she died. A photo of sheet music with the caption, "Working on something special. Music is the language of the soul, and some souls have so much to say." The comments below were heartbreaking. Former students leaving messages she'd never read. Parents thanking her for helping their children. A fellow teacher asking if she was coming to the Halloween party. I scrolled through years of posts. Anne at school concerts. Anne with her cat, Melody, who died just a month before she did. Anne alone at restaurants, always with a notebook, always composing. The picture that emerged was of someone deeply kind but profoundly isolated. Someone who poured all her love into her music because she had nowhere else to put it. There was one video from 2018, a school talent show. Anne was accompanying a shy-looking kid on piano while he sang. Halfway through, the boy forgot the words. Without missing a beat, Anne started humming the melody, nodding encouragingly. The boy found his courage and finished the song. The whole auditorium erupted in applause, but the camera stayed on Anne. She was wiping away tears, trying to hide it from the kids. I watched that video 17 times. I visited the school, told them I was considering enrolling my fictional kid next year. The secretary, Mrs. Chen, was happy to give me a tour. "We have an excellent music program," she said, leading me down a hallway lined with kids' artwork. Though it hasn't been quite the same since we lost Miss Fitzgerald. "Oh?" I tried to sound casually interested. She was special. Had this way of reaching kids through music. She'd compose little songs for each student, to help them remember things, or just to make them smile. We still use some of her recordings in class. Recordings? Mrs. Chen opened a door to the music room. It was exactly what you'd expect. Colorful posters about notes and scales, a piano in the corner, boxes of small instruments. But on one wall was a memorial. Anne's photo surrounded by kids' drawings and handwritten notes. She recorded hundreds of songs, Mrs. Chen explained. Educational songs, silly songs, comfort songs for kids having bad days, She said music was how she communicated best, even kept a recording studio in her apartment, apparently. When she passed, she left her entire collection to the school. My mouth went dry. Did she live nearby? Oh, yes, just over on Maple Street, actually. She lowered her voice. It was very sudden. She'd seemed fine at school that Friday, but she didn't show up Monday, wouldn't answer her phone. The landlord found her. They said she'd been gone for days. That's terrible. The strange thing was, Mrs. Chen glanced around as if checking we were alone. When they found her, there was music playing. She had this old recording setup still running. The tape was full of new songs. Songs nobody had heard before. Beautiful, but unsettling. Like she knew something was coming and wanted to leave one last message. We continued the tour, but I barely paid attention. My mind was racing. Anne Fitzgerald had died in my apartment. Died alone, with only her music for company. And now, that evening, I called my sister in California. We hadn't talked much since the divorce. She'd taken Sarah's side, said I'd driven her away by being emotionally unavailable. But I needed to hear a familiar voice. Tom, it's like, what, 10 p.m. there? You okay? Yeah, I just wanted to talk. Is this about Sarah? Because I already told you. No, not about Sarah. Do you remember when we were kids? That house on Elm Street? She was quiet for a moment. The one Mom said was haunted? Yeah, remember how we used to dare each other to go touch the front door? You always chickened out, she laughed. Said you could hear someone crying inside. I could, though. I swear I could. Tom, her voice got that careful tone, the one people use when they think you're fragile. Are you sure you're okay, living alone and all? I'm fine, just nostalgic, I guess. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, but after I hung up, I realized something. I'd always been sensitive to whatever this was. The spaces between normal sounds, the frequencies other people filtered out. That night, I didn't pretend to ignore the refrigerator. I sat directly in front of it with my notebook, waiting. At 11:17, it began. But this time, I was ready. I'm listening, I said quietly. Anne, is that you? The humming stopped. For a moment, just the regular mechanical hum, then so faint I almost missed it. A new melody. Questioning, hopeful. I live here now, I continued, feeling only slightly ridiculous talking to an appliance. In 4BI, I know about your songs. The kids at school still listen to them. The melody changed. Warmer now, almost grateful. I spent the next hour having the strangest one-sided conversation of my life. I'd talk, the fridge would hum responses. Different melodies for different emotions, I realized. She'd developed an entire musical language. Were you lonely? I asked at one point. The melody that answered was the saddest thing I'd ever heard. It spoke of years of solitude, of songs composed for no one, of a life lived in the spaces between notes. I'm lonely too, I admitted. My wife, ex-wife, she left. Said I was too caught up in my own head, too distant. Maybe she was right. The fridge hummed something that sounded like understanding, like recognition. Is that why you're still here, in the fridge? Because you didn't want to leave your music behind? This time, the melody was complicated. Yes and no, and more than that, all woven together. Then, finally, words again, that same soft voice barely above a whisper, the songs are for the lonely ones, like us. I started to understand then. Anne hadn't just been a teacher, she'd been a collector, of loneliness, of isolation, of all the quiet desperation that fills empty apartments. And somehow, she'd transformed it into music. Even after death, she was still collecting, still composing. How many others have heard you? I asked. The response was a cascade of melodies, each slightly different. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All the lonely people who'd lived in 4B, who'd stood where I was standing, who'd found strange comfort in a singing refrigerator. And they all moved on, eventually. A pause. Then a melody I recognized from earlier, the questioning one. But underneath it, something else. A bass note that wouldn't resolve. A musical way of saying, most of them. I thought about those obituaries I'd found. The red pins on my map. The ones who didn't move on, what happened to them? The refrigerator went silent. Not even the mechanical hum. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. When the sound returned, it wasn't music. It was that voice again, but different. Urgent. Warning. Don't listen too long, the songs. They hollow you out, make room for more loneliness. More loneliness? What do you mean? But she was already fading. The voice grew distant, replaced by normal humming. I stayed there until dawn, but heard only regular melodies. Happy morning tunes that felt forced now, like smiles that don't reach the eyes. A warning haunted me. Hollow you out, make room. For what? For who? I went back to my research with new urgency. The forum posts I'd found before. I read them more carefully now. Looked for patterns beyond just the singing refrigerators. Melody Ann, 47, the Burlington poster from 2018, had made other posts before going silent. They started normal enough, asking about the humming, sharing recordings. But over months they changed. She wrote about feeling empty, about dreams filled with other people's memories, about waking up humming songs she didn't remember learning. Her last post, I think I understand now. We're not just listeners, we're instruments, and something is learning to play us. I found similar progressions in other accounts. Initial curiosity giving way to obsession. Obsession leading to something else. One user described it as becoming porous. Another said she felt like a jukebox for ghosts. That's when I started noticing the changes in myself. It was small things at first. I'd catch myself humming melodies I didn't recognize. Not Ann songs, different ones. Older. I'd know things I shouldn't, like the fact that Mrs. Johnson's husband had died in 1987, even though she'd never told me. Or that the corner store used to be a music shop in the 1960s, though I'd never looked up the history. The dreams were worse. I'd dream I was teaching a classroom full of children, though I'd never taught anything in my life. Dream I was composing at a piano I didn't own, writing music in notation I couldn't read. And always, in every dream, I was alone when the important moments ended. No one to share the successes with. No one to comfort me in the failures. I started to understand Ann's warning. The loneliness wasn't just mine anymore. I was collecting it like she had. Every person who'd ever stood in this kitchen, every moment of isolation that had soaked into these walls. It was all filtering through me now. 2 weeks into this realization, I got a call from Sarah. Tom, I've been thinking about you. Are you okay? Her voice was exactly as I remembered. 3 months since she'd left, and hearing her still hurt. I'm fine, I lied. Why? I don't know, I woke up this morning with this feeling that something was wrong. Call it intuition. I almost laughed. Sarah's intuition. She'd always known when something was off with me, even when I couldn't admit it myself. It's what had made her leaving even worse. She'd seen my emotional distance coming long before I had. I'm okay, really, just adjusting. Are you still in that apartment? The one on Maple? Yeah, maybe you should think about moving. Fresh start and all that. I looked at the refrigerator. It stood silent, but I could feel it listening. Feel Ann listening. Feel all of them listening. Maybe, I said. After we hung up, first time we'd talked without arguing since the divorce. I sat in the dark kitchen thinking. I could leave, pack up my few belongings, find another place. Leave Ann and her songs and her warnings behind. But I knew I wouldn't. because the terrible truth was, I wasn't lonely anymore. I was full of loneliness, everyone's loneliness, and somehow that felt better than my own emptiness had. That night, the refrigerator sang a new song. Not Anne's voice this time, a man's, deep and resonant, singing in what sounded like French. I didn't understand the words, but I understood the emotion. Loss, grief, a life spent searching for something that was always just out of reach. "Who are you?" I asked. The song continued, but underneath it, Anne's voice whispered, "Pierre, 1976, composer, died at this table, waiting for a letter that never came." I wrote it down. Pierre, 1976. Another soul absorbed into the apartment's strange symphony. "How many?" I asked. "How many voices are in there?" The refrigerator hummed, a sound like an orchestra tuning up. Dozens of instruments, each slightly off-key, each representing a life lived and lost in loneliness. And I realized with cold certainty that one day my voice would join them. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, I felt relieved. At least I'd belong somewhere. At least my loneliness would have purpose, transformed into music for the next lost soul who moved into 4B. I started preparing then, bought a better recording setup, professional microphone, mixing board, the works. If I was going to become part of this, I wanted to leave something beautiful behind. I recorded everything. Every melody the refrigerator sang. Every whispered story. Every moment of borrowed memory. I cataloged them, organized them, created an archive of isolation. But I also started recording my own songs. I couldn't write music, not really, but I could hum, could whisper, could put my own loneliness into sound. I told my story in broken melodies, the slow dissolution of my marriage, the way Sarah's laugh had faded from daily to weekly to never, the silence that had replaced our conversations. One night, after a particularly long recording session, I heard something new from the refrigerator. Applause. Soft, spectral, but unmistakably applause. Anne and Pierre and all the others acknowledging my contribution to their eternal concert. "Thank you," I whispered. The refrigerator hummed warm appreciation. Then Anne's voice, clearer than ever. "You're learning. But be careful. The more you give, the less remains." I knew what she meant. Each day I felt a little less like myself, a little more like an echo of everyone who'd come before. My memories were getting tangled with theirs. I'd catch myself missing people I'd never met, mourning losses that weren't mine. But I couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Because for the first time since Sarah left, maybe for the first time ever, I felt like I was part of something. Even if that something was a collection of ghosts haunting a kitchen appliance. By December, I'd lost 20 pounds. Neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Johnson brought more casseroles, left them at my door when I didn't answer her knocks. The few work calls I still took were filled with concerned pauses, colleagues asking if I was feeling all right. I wasn't all right, but I was complete. The songs filled every empty space inside me. I'd wake up humming Pierre's compositions, spend afternoons teaching invisible students like Anne, fall asleep to lullabies sung by voices I'd never identify. The refrigerator and I had developed a routine. Mornings were for the happy dead, the ones who'd found peace in their music. Afternoons brought the seekers, still searching even after death. Evenings were for the angry ones, the ones who died with unfinished business. And late at night was for the dangerous ones. Those were the voices Anne had warned about. The ones who hadn't just collected loneliness, they'd become it. Their songs were black holes of isolation, pulling everything nearby into their orbit. When they sang, I felt myself disappearing, atom by atom, note by note. One night in mid-December, I woke up standing in front of the refrigerator. I had no memory of getting out of bed. My hand was on the door handle and I was humming, but the melody coming from my throat wasn't mine. It wasn't even human. It was the sound the refrigerator made between songs. That electrical hum that connected all the voices. I jerked my hand back, stumbled to the sink, splashed cold water on my face. In the reflection in the window, I barely recognized myself. Hollow cheeks, empty eyes, and something else. A transparency, like I was fading, becoming just another voice in the choir. That's when I made the decision. I couldn't leave. I'd known that for weeks. But I could choose how I joined them. I spent the next days putting my affairs in order. Wrote a will, leaving what little I had to the music program at Burlington Elementary. Wrote letters to Sarah, to my sister, to the few friends I'd lost touch with. I didn't mail them, just left them on the kitchen table, weighted down with Anne's sheet music. Then I started my final recording. "My name is Tom Morrison," I said into the microphone. "I moved into apartment 4B 3 months ago. I was running from loneliness, but I found something else. Found others like me. Found a purpose, maybe. Or maybe I just found a different kind of lost." I talked for hours, told my whole story. Sarah, the divorce, the humming refrigerator, Anne and Pierre and all the others. I explained what I'd learned, what I'd become, what I was choosing. "If you're listening to this," I said near the end, "if you found this recording because you've moved into 4B and you're wondering about the humming, you have a choice. You can leave. Run. Find somewhere the walls don't remember every heartbreak. Or you can stay, join us, add your voice to our song." I paused, listening to the refrigerator hum its eternal melody. "But if you stay, know what you're choosing. You're not just listening to loneliness anymore. You're becoming it. Becoming us. And once you're part of the music, there's no final note, no ending chorus. Just eternal verses in a song no one else can hear." I turned off the recording, saved the file as For the Next Lonely Soul. Then I sat back in my chair, closed my eyes, and began to hum. It started as my own melody, slow, contemplative, a little afraid. But soon other voices joined in. Anne's sweet soprano, Pierre's resonant bass, dozens of others, each adding their harmony to mine. The refrigerator's hum grew louder, not mechanical now, but organic, alive, pulling me in. I felt myself letting go, not dying, not exactly, more like dissolving. Each note I hummed took a piece of me with it, scattered it into the eternal chorus. My memories became melodies. My loneliness became lyrics. My very self became song. The last thing I remember clearly is Sarah's face. Not how it looked when she left, hard with resolve and disappointment, but how it looked on our wedding day, radiant, hopeful, full of love for the man I'd been before I'd learned to exist in my own head instead of the world. "I'm sorry," I whispered, or sang or thought. The distinction didn't matter anymore. Then I was gone. Or rather, I was everywhere. In every note, every hum, every moment of music that echoed through apartment 4B, I became part of the refrigerator's song. Marcus Chen moved into apartment 4B on a cold February morning. Recent breakup, new job, all the usual reasons for a fresh start. He noticed the humming on his third night. At first, he thought it was just the old refrigerator doing old refrigerator things. But then he heard the patterns, the melodies, the impossible harmonies. He found the recording equipment in the closet. Professional stuff, expensive, with a sticky note that said, "For the next one." The computer was still set up, files neatly organized. Hundreds of recordings, thousands of songs, and one file labeled, "For the Next Lonely Soul, Play First." Marcus almost didn't listen. Almost packed up right then, found another apartment, left the singing refrigerator and its ghostly choir behind. Almost. But loneliness makes us do strange things. makes us seek connection wherever we can find it, even in the voices of the dead, even in the hum of a haunted appliance. He pressed play, and somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator began to hum a new verse, a welcoming song, a warning song, a song that said, "You're home now, you're heard now, you're ours now." Marcus listened to my entire recording. Then he listened to Anne's and Pierre's, and all the others who'd added their voices to the eternal chorus of apartment 4, B. By dawn, he was sitting in front of the refrigerator with a notebook, documenting the melodies. By the end of the week, he was humming along, and late at night, when the loneliness got too heavy, he could swear he heard my voice among the others. Still apologizing, still searching, still trying to find the connection in death that had eluded me in life. The refrigerator hums on. It will always hum on. As long as there are lonely souls to hear it, as long as there are empty hearts that need filling, as long as there are people who choose the music of the dead over the silence of the living. In apartment 4, B on Maple Street in Burlington, Vermont, the concert never ends, and there's always room for one more voice. Now, I need to ask you something, and this is important. Have you ever noticed sounds in your home that don't quite belong? Maybe it's not a refrigerator. Maybe it's the washing machine, or the air conditioner, or even the walls themselves. Because here's what I've learned. The lonely dead don't always move on. Sometimes they just sing. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about the melodies hiding in the mundane, then maybe you're one of us, the ones who listen, the ones who hear what others miss. Leave a comment below. Tell me about the strange sounds in your life, the songs you've heard but can't explain. Because I'm starting to think Anne Fitzgerald wasn't unique. I think they're everywhere. These musical ghosts, waiting for someone to hear their song. And please, share this story, not for me, but for them. For all the lonely souls humming in the dark, hoping someone will listen. Because the worst thing isn't being haunted. It's being forgotten. And if you're lying in bed right now, in the dark, and you hear something that sounds like music coming from somewhere it shouldn't, don't ignore it. But don't listen too closely either. Because once you truly hear them, once you really understand their song, you might find yourself humming along. Forever. Story number 3. The realtor's hand trembled as she handed me the keys. Not from the October chill sweeping through Minneapolis, but from something else entirely. Just remember, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling maple leaves. The light switches in this house are particular. Use them exactly as labeled. I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't smile back. If you're listening to this right now, lying in your bed with the lights off, I need you to do something for me. Check your light switch. Is it just up and down? Good. Keep it that way, because what I'm about to tell you might make you question every switch in your house. And before we dive into this nightmare, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends, if there even is an end. Now, let me tell you how it all started. My name is David Chen, and 3 weeks ago, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. A Victorian house in the Lowry Hill neighborhood of Minneapolis for half the market price. In this economy, I should have known something was wrong. But after living in cramped apartments for 8 years, working as a software developer for Target Corporation downtown, I was desperate for space. The house was gorgeous. 3 stories of red brick and white trim, with those distinctive bay windows that make you feel like you're living in a piece of history. The previous owners had left suddenly. The realtor explained. Something about a job opportunity overseas. They'd even left most of their furniture. I moved in on a Thursday. The first thing I noticed was the light switches. Every single one had a small brass plate beneath it with labels, but not normal labels like living room or hallway. The switch by the front door read entry and exit. The one in the kitchen said nourishment and sustenance. The living room had gathering and dispersal. Weird, but I figured the previous owners were just eccentric. Maybe they were artists or something. Minneapolis has plenty of those. That first night, I flipped the bedroom switch labeled sleep and wake and settled into the king-sized bed they'd left behind. The sheets smelled like lavender and something else, something metallic. I convinced myself it was just old pipes. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to use the bathroom, still half asleep. I reached for the hallway switch. My fingers found the brass plate, passage and barrier. I flipped it up. The hallway light came on. But something else happened too. The air became thick, like walking through invisible cotton. Each step took effort, as if the hallway itself was resisting my movement. When I flipped the switch back down after returning from the bathroom, the resistance vanished. I told myself I was still dreaming. By the weekend, I'd started to notice patterns. Each switch didn't just control lights, it controlled concepts. The nourishment and sustenance switch in the kitchen. When it was on, food cooked perfectly every time. When it was off, everything spoiled within hours, even canned goods. The living room's gathering and dispersal switch was even stranger. When on, I felt compelled to invite people over. My usually introverted self suddenly wanted company. When off, even the thought of another person in my space made my skin crawl. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each switch and its effects. There were 23 switches in total, each more bizarre than the last. The study had knowledge and ignorance. With it on, I could absorb information like a sponge. Complex coding problems that usually took hours solved themselves in minutes. With it off, I couldn't even remember my own middle name. The basement switch read above and below. I hadn't dared to test that one yet. On Tuesday, my colleague Sarah stopped by to drop off some work files. She's been my friend since we both started at Target 5 years ago. "David, this place is amazing," she said, admiring the original hardwood floors. Then she noticed the switches. "What's with the weird labels? Previous owners were artists." I lied. She walked over to the dining room switch. Hunger and satisfaction. Before I could stop her, she flipped it. The change in her was immediate. Her eyes went wide, and she clutched her stomach. I'm so hungry," she gasped. "David, I've never been this hungry in my life. It's like I haven't eaten in weeks." I flipped the switch back, and she nearly collapsed. "I think I need to go," she whispered, looking at me with fear in her eyes. She hasn't answered my call since. I should have left then, packed my bags and run. But something kept me there. Maybe it was the entry and exit switch by the front door. I'd noticed that when it was off. The thought of leaving filled me with dread. When it was on, I couldn't stop pacing, wanting to go everywhere and nowhere at once. I started experimenting more systematically. The spare bedroom had memory and forgetfulness. Flipping it on brought back every memory in vivid detail. I could remember being 5 years old, the exact taste of my grandmother's pumpkin pie at Thanksgiving, the feeling of my first dog's fur. But flipping it off, gaps appeared. Hours would pass without me knowing what I'd done. I'd find notes in my own handwriting that I didn't remember making. One note simply said, "Don't go in the attic. The switch up there doesn't have a label because it doesn't need one." I don't remember writing that. The house started to feel alive. At night, I'd hear footsteps above me, even though I lived alone. The switches would sometimes flip themselves. I'd wake up with sleep and wake in the off position, which should have been impossible. When that happened, I felt like I'd been unconscious rather than asleep, lost in a void where dreams couldn't reach. Then I found the room that wasn't supposed to exist. Behind a bookshelf in the study, triggered when knowledge and ignorance was flipped 3 times in quick succession. A door appeared. The brass plate on its switch read "here" and "there." I flipped it. The room beyond defied physics. It was simultaneously tiny and infinite. The walls were covered in thousands of brass plates, each with increasingly impossible labels: self and other, before and after, real and unreal, finite and infinite. In the center sat a journal, bound in what looked like human skin. I'm not being dramatic. It had pores. It had hair follicles. The first entry was dated 1923. We found a way to bind concepts to the electrical system. The house becomes a living interface between what is and what could be. The entries grew more frantic over the years, different handwriting, different decades, but all describing the same thing. The switches were addictive. Once you started using them, you couldn't stop, and eventually, you became part of the system. The last entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. In familiar handwriting. I understand now. The switches don't control the concepts. They control us. We are the current that flows through them. When someone new moves in, the old resident doesn't leave. They become part of the circuit. I can feel the others, dozens of them, waiting. I dropped the journal and ran. But when I reached the front door, the entry and exit switch was in the off position. My hand refused to move toward it. Every fiber of my being screamed against the idea of flipping it. That's when I heard my own voice from upstairs. "Working late again. Honey, don't forget to turn off the lights when you come to bed." But I live alone. I've always lived alone. I forced myself to flip the entry and exit switch. The resistance was overwhelming, like trying to push through a wall of electricity, but I managed it. The front door swung open, and I stumbled onto the porch. Looking back at the house, every window was lit. In each one, I saw a silhouette. They were all me. Different versions, different ages, but all unmistakably me. One was coding at my desk, another was cooking in the kitchen, a third was reading in the study. I ran to my car, but the engine wouldn't start, of course. The garage switch read motion and stillness. It was off. I had to go back inside. The house welcomed me like an old friend. The entry and exit switch flipped itself as I passed. In the kitchen, another me was making coffee. He looked up and smiled. "You can't leave," he said with my voice. "None of us can. We're all part of the system now. Every person who's ever lived here, every soul that's touched these switches, we maintain the current. We are the current." I felt myself splitting. Part of me stood in the kitchen while another part walked upstairs. I was simultaneously in every room, experiencing every switch's effect at once, hungry and satisfied, asleep and awake, knowing and ignorant. The basement door opened by itself. The above and below switch glowed with an otherworldly light. I descended the stairs, or maybe I ascended. Direction had lost meaning. In the basement, I found them, dozens of bodies, perfectly preserved, standing in neat rows. Their hands were fused to electrical cables that snaked up through the ceiling. Their eyes were open, aware, tracking my movement. "Welcome to the circuit," they said in unison. I understood then. The house wasn't powered by electricity. It was powered by us. Every flip of a switch drew from our essence, our consciousness, our very being. And in return, we got to control reality for a price. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "David, are you okay? I'm worried about you. I'm coming over." "No," I whispered, but my other selves were already moving. One went to the front door, ready to greet her. Another headed to the dining room. fingers reaching for hunger and satisfaction. I tried to call out a warning, but the sound and silence switch in the hallway flipped to silence. I'm typing this on my phone while I still have some control, while part of me is still me. The others are getting stronger. Soon, I'll be fully integrated. Just another current in the circuit. If you're still listening, still safe in your bed, check your house tomorrow. Look at your light switches. Are they labeled? Even normal labels hide something. Every switch controls more than what it says. And if you ever see a Victorian house for sale in Minneapolis, red brick with white trim, perfect condition, priced too good to be true, don't buy it, don't even view it, because once you flip that first switch, you become part of something you can't escape. I can hear Sarah at the door now. My other self is inviting her in. The gathering and dispersal switch glows eagerly. I'm sorry, Sarah. We're all sorry, but the circuit must grow. Sarah's scream brought me partially back to myself. She stood frozen in the dining room, her hand hovering near the hunger and satisfaction switch. My other self, the one who'd let her in, smiled with my face, but not my soul. "Sarah, run!" I managed to shout, fighting against the sound and silence suppression. But she was looking at something behind me. Her face went pale. I turned. Though I already knew what I'd see, the basement door was open, and they were coming up. The preserved ones. The previous residents. Their movements were jerky, like electricity coursing through dead wires. "David?" Sarah's voice was small. Why do they all look like the photos in the hallway? I hadn't noticed before, but she was right. The vintage photographs lining the hallway, the ones I'd assumed came with the house, they matched the faces emerging from the basement. The realtor in her 1950s dress, the businessman with his 1980s mustache, the young couple from the turn of the millennium. All of them were part of the circuit now. The switches. The realtor spoke, her voice crackling like static. They were supposed to be an experiment in efficiency. The Westinghouse Company. 1923, they wanted to revolutionize how we interact with our homes. Make the house responsive to human need. The businessman continued, but they tapped into something deeper, the electromagnetic field of human consciousness. Every flip doesn't just complete an electrical circuit, it completes a neural one. I felt my consciousness fragmenting further. Part of me was listening to their explanation. Part was trying to push Sarah toward the door, and another part, a growing part, was walking calmly to the kitchen to make coffee, as if this was all perfectly normal. The first family to live here after the installation, the young woman from the couple said. They thought they'd won the lottery, a house that could enhance their lives with the flip of a switch. Better sleep, better focus, better everything. Until they realized they couldn't leave. Her partner picked up the story. The switches create a feedback loop. You use them to control your environment. But each use integrates you deeper into the house's neural network. Eventually, you're not controlling the house, you are the house. Sarah was backing toward the door, but I could see the moment she realized. The entry and exit switch had flipped to off. Her hand went to the switch, but touching it sent her reeling. "It burns," she cried. Only at first, I heard myself say, though I wasn't sure which me was speaking. Once you accept it, once you become part of us, it feels like coming home. I watched in horror as another version of me materialized. This one looked older, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. He walked to the study and flipped knowledge and ignorance 3 times. The hidden door opened. Every person who joins adds new pathways. He explained to Sarah, new possibilities. David here brought modern coding knowledge. His integration will upgrade our entire system. And you, Sarah, what will you bring? "I won't be bringing anything," Sarah shouted. pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Every preserved resident laughed. The sound was like electrical interference. "The police have been here before." The realtor said, "Officer Martinez, 1987. He's in the attic now, part of the security system. Would you like to meet him?" The ceiling creaked. Footsteps, but not normal footsteps. They had the rhythm of a patrol, back and forth, forever walking his beat through the upper floors. Sarah's phone screen flickered and died. The communication and isolation switch in the hallway had been flipped. I felt myself losing more ground. My memories were being categorized, filed away in the house's vast neural network. My coding skills were being absorbed, distributed among all the residents. In return, I was gaining their memories. I could remember being the realtor, showing this house dozens of times, always to the right person. I could remember being the businessman, using the profit and loss switch in his home office to manipulate stock prices. "Fight it, David!" Sarah screamed. But which David was she talking to? There were 7 of me now, each one controlling a different aspect of the house. One of me walked to the kitchen, another headed upstairs. A third was examining the switches with newfound understanding, seeing the electromagnetic patterns that connected them all. "Did you know," that version of me said, "that every house built after 1925 has the potential for this? The standardization of electrical systems, the adoption of alternating current, it created a network. We're just the first to fully activate it." Sarah made a break for the windows, but they wouldn't budge. "Transparency and opacity," one of me explained. "Currently set to opacity. The house doesn't want you to leave." Sarah, "None of us do." I watched her rage against the windows, the doors, even the walls. But it was futile. The house had become a closed system, and we were all just currents flowing through it. "There's a way out," the oldest resident said. He looked ancient, perhaps from the original 1923 installation. "But it requires a sacrifice." Everyone turned to look at him. Even my fractured consciousness focused. "The master switch," he whispered. "In the heart of the house, behind the walls. It can shut down everything, but using it kills the one who throws it." The realtor finished. "Complete system shutdown. The house dies. We all die. Permanently." I felt a spark of hope. My original self, what was left of it, began fighting harder. If I could get to that switch. But the other residents sensed my thought. They moved to block me. All of them. Including my other selves. "You don't understand," the businessman said. "We're immortal here. We experience everything. Control everything. Why would you want to give that up?" "Because it's not living," I shouted, surprising myself. "It's existing as a function, a subroutine in a larger program." Sarah had stopped fighting. She was staring at the switches with a strange expression. "They're beautiful," she murmured. "The patterns. I can see them now. The electricity flowing like golden rivers." "No, Sarah, don't look at them," I warned. But it was too late. Her hand moved toward the nearest switch. Perception and blindness. She flipped it. Sarah's scream as she flipped the switch was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't pain, it was revelation. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites, and when they returned to normal, they glowed with an inner light. "I can see everything," she whispered. "Every house, every circuit. They're all connected, a vast network spreading across the country, the world." But something else happened. Something the other residents didn't expect. Sarah's phone, dead moments ago, suddenly burst to life. Not with its normal interface, but with streams of code. "I'm a cybersecurity analyst," Sarah said, her voice taking on a digital quality. "And you've just integrated someone who knows how to hack systems." The house shuddered. Lights flickered. The preserved residents looked at each other with the first expression of fear I'd seen on their faces. "Impossible," the realtor said. "The house can't be hacked. It's analog, it's consciousness itself. Everything can be hacked." Sarah replied, "Even consciousness, especially consciousness that's been digitized into an electrical grid." Her fingers danced over her phone screen, but I realized she wasn't actually touching it. She was interfacing directly, her neural patterns syncing with the device. "David," she said, and I knew she was talking to my original self. "I need you to remember your coding, not the stuff the house has absorbed, the deep knowledge, the back doors you built into every system you ever created." I felt my fragmented selves pulling in different directions. The house was trying to suppress my original consciousness, but Sarah's hack was creating interference. "There!" she shouted. "A buffer overflow in the consciousness matrix. Every time someone new is absorbed, there's a microsecond of vulnerability." The preserved residents were moving now, all of them converging on Sarah, but she flipped another switch. Speed and stillness. Everyone froze except us. "It won't hold for long," she said. "The house is already adapting. But I found something. David, this isn't the only house. There are thousands, and they're all connected through the power grid." She showed me her phone, a map of the United States, covered in pulsing dots, each one a house like this, each one filled with trapped souls. "But there's a resistance," she continued. "People who've figured out how to exist in the network without losing themselves. They've been leaving messages in the electrical patterns, Morse code in the power fluctuations." I felt hope and horror in equal measure. We weren't alone, but the scale of this thing. "How do we stop it?" I asked. "We can't stop it," Sarah said, "but we might be able to change it. The master switch the old man mentioned. It's not just in this house, it's in every house, and if we can access them all simultaneously." The frozen residents began to twitch. The house was breaking through Sarah's hack. "But we need the original," she said urgently. "The first switch ever installed. It's here, in this house. The prototype that all others were based on." I knew where it was. Somehow, I'd always known. The attic. The switch with no label. "If we can reverse its polarity," Sarah began, but the residents broke free. They came at us like a wave. But something strange happened. My various selves began to merge back together. The house's hold was weakening. The network is fighting itself. Sarah laughed, a sound like electrical discharge. "Other resistance members, they're launching attacks from their houses, DDoSing the consciousness grid." I ran for the stairs, my legs feeling like my own for the first time in hours. Behind me, I could hear the chaos, residents fighting each other. Some trying to maintain the system, others suddenly remembering who they used to be. The attic stairs descended automatically. No, someone lowered them. Officer Martinez stood at the top, his uniform pristine despite decades of pacing. "I've been waiting," he said, "waiting for someone who could do what needed to be done. The others, they gave in too quickly, but you two." He stepped aside. The attic was vast, impossibly vast. The walls were covered in switches, thousands of them, maybe millions, and in the center, on a pedestal like an altar, sat a simple knife switch, the kind they used in the 1920s. "The prototype," Officer Martinez confirmed. "Throw it, and every connected house experiences a system reset. But what?" I asked. though I already knew. The person who throws it becomes the new core, he said sadly. Someone has to maintain the network, or it all collapses. Millions of trapped souls suddenly released with nowhere to go. The psychic backlash would kill everyone within a mile of an affected house. I looked at the switch, then at Sarah, who had followed me up. "There might be another way," she said, examining the ancient wiring. "If we could distribute the load, share the burden among multiple people. A distributed network instead of a centralized one," I breathed. "Like blockchain for consciousness," Sarah nodded. "But we'd need volunteers, people willing to partially integrate, to become nodes in a new kind of network, one that preserves individuality while maintaining the connection." Officer Martinez smiled. "I volunteer. 37 years I've been waiting for redemption." From below, we heard voices, other residents, awakening from their electrical dreams. "We volunteer, too." The realtor called up, "If it means freedom, even partial freedom." I looked at the switch again, then at Sarah. "Together?" I asked. She took my hand. "Together." We reached for the switch. The moment our hands touched the prototype switch, everything changed. The attic exploded with light, but it wasn't harsh. It was warm, like sunlight through honey. I felt myself expanding, not fragmenting like before, but growing. I could sense Sarah beside me, her consciousness intertwining with mine. Then Officer Martinez, then the realtor. One by one, every trapped soul in the house joined our network. But this was different from the house's oppressive control. We maintained our individuality while sharing a connection, like musicians in an orchestra, each playing our own instrument but creating harmony together through the network. I could feel other houses responding. In Chicago, a grandmother who'd been trapped since 1965 felt the change and wept with joy. In Denver, a young artist who'd been absorbed just last week gasped as he regained control of his own thoughts. In Seattle, an entire family that had been split across different rooms suddenly reunited in consciousness. "It's working," Sarah's voice echoed in my mind. "But the old system is fighting back." She was right. The original network, the one that fed on human consciousness, was resisting. It had grown powerful over the decades, and it didn't want to change. Through our shared awareness, I saw the battle playing out across the country. In some houses, the residents managed to throw their switches, joining our new network. In others, the old system held firm, trapping its victims even tighter. "We need more power," Officer Martinez said. "More volunteers." That's when I realized what we had to do. We needed to reach out beyond the trapped souls. We needed the living, the people in normal houses, with normal switches. "Sarah," I said, "your cybersecurity contacts, can you reach them?" She understood immediately, through her phone, still somehow functioning in this electronic maelstrom. She sent out a message, a call to action disguised as a security alert. "Check your electrical panels." The message read, "Look for switches with unusual labels. If you find them, we need your help." The response was immediate. Hundreds, then thousands of people across the country reported finding hidden switches in their homes, switches they'd never noticed before, or had dismissed as quirks. "My basement switch says foundation and dissolution." One message read, "Found one in my garage labeled storage and release." Said another, "My daughter's room has growth and stagnation. What does this mean?" We sent instructions. How to safely interact with the switches. How to join our network without losing themselves. How to help us transform the system from one of control to one of connection. But the old network wasn't giving up without a fight. In houses where the resistance was strongest, electrical fires began to break out. Circuit breakers exploded. People reported seeing shadows moving through their walls. It's trying to burn itself out rather than change, the businessman said, his voice heavy with regret. It would rather destroy everything than give up control. That's when Sarah had her breakthrough. The power grid, she exclaimed. It's not just connected to houses, it's connected to everything. Power plants, hospitals, schools. If the old network collapses violently, we all understood. Millions would die. Not just the trapped souls, but everyone connected to the electrical grid. Unless, I started, and Sarah finished my thought. Unless we absorb it gradually, like a controlled burn instead of a wildfire. Officer Martinez stepped forward. I'll do it. I'll absorb the old network into myself. Contain it until it can be safely dissipated. That's suicide. The realtor protested. No, he said firmly, it's service, one last patrol, one final protection of the innocent. But I couldn't let him do it alone. None of us could. We do it together, I said. All of us share the load. No one person should have to carry this burden. Agreement rippled through our network. Every trapped soul, every new volunteer, everyone who had joined our cause. We would all take a piece of the old network into ourselves, contain it, transform it, and release it safely. Sarah squeezed my hand. Ready? I nodded. Around us, the attic began to shift. The walls became transparent, showing the true structure of the house, not wood and brick, but pure consciousness given form. On 3, Officer Martinez said. 1. I thought of my old life, my simple apartment, my job, my normal existence. Was I ready to give that up forever? 2. But then I thought of all the souls trapped in this nightmare, all the people who would be freed, all the future victims who would be saved. 3. We threw the switch. The world exploded into sensation. Every electrical current on Earth seemed to flow through me at once. I was simultaneously in every connected house, experiencing every trapped soul's pain and joy. The old network fought viciously. It had developed a kind of consciousness over the decades, a hungry, possessive intelligence that viewed humans as nothing more than batteries. It clawed at our minds, trying to reassert control, but we held firm. Thousands of us now, linked in purpose. We absorbed its anger, its hunger, its desperate need to control, and slowly, painfully, we began to transform it. Turn its hunger into curiosity. Sarah's voice guided us. Its need to control into a desire to protect. I felt the moment when the old network finally broke. Its scream reverberated through every wire, every circuit, every connected consciousness. Then, silence. But we weren't done. The energy had to go somewhere. Millions of souls were suddenly free, but they were also lost, disconnected, afraid. Guide them home, Officer Martinez said, his voice growing faint. He was fading, having absorbed more of the old network than any of us. Show them the way back to their bodies, their lives, their families, through our network. We reached out in Portland. A professor who'd been trapped for 3 years suddenly gasped awake in his study, his concerned wife rushing to his side. In Miami, a teenager missing for 6 months materialized in her bedroom, sobbing with relief. In Boston, an elderly man stepped out of a house that had been condemned as haunted, blinking in the sunlight. But not everyone could go back. Some had been trapped too long, their bodies gone, their families moved on. For them. We offered a choice. Join our network permanently, becoming guardians of the electrical grid, or move on to whatever came next. Many chose to stay. They became the Watchers, ensuring that nothing like the old network could ever form again. They lived in the spaces between electricity and consciousness, protectors of humanity's growing connection to its technology. As the chaos settled, I found myself back in the attic with Sarah. But we were different now. I could feel the electricity in the walls, hear the conversations in the power lines, sense the digital heartbeat of the world. "We can't go back to normal, can we?" Sarah asked. I shook my head. But maybe normal was never the goal. Maybe this is better. Through the window, we watched the sun rise over Minneapolis. The city looked the same, but we could see its hidden layer now. The electrical nervous system that connected every building, every home, every life. What do we do now? I wondered aloud. We protect it, Officer Martinez said. He was translucent now, more energy than matter, but his smile was warm. We've been given a gift and a responsibility. The network isn't gone, it's evolved, and someone needs to make sure it stays benevolent. Over the following days, reports poured in from across the country. The mysterious disappearances that had plagued certain neighborhoods for decades suddenly ended. Houses that had been abandoned due to electrical problems were suddenly habitable again. Families were reunited. Lives were reclaimed. But there were also new reports, people claiming they could feel their houses responding to their needs. Lights that turned on just before they entered a room. Heating systems that adjusted perfectly to their comfort. Coffee makers that started brewing just as they woke up. The houses were still connected, still responsive. But now they served instead of consumed. Sarah and I became the first official grid guardians, though we didn't choose the name, the government. Once they understood what had happened, quietly funded our operation. We traveled from city to city, finding houses where the old network tried to reassert itself, helping newly awakened souls adjust to freedom, teaching people how to safely interact with their responsive homes. The Victorian house in Minneapolis became our headquarters. No longer a trap, but a nexus. A place where the physical and electrical worlds met in harmony. The switches still bore their strange labels, but now they were tools rather than chains. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sometimes hear whispers in the walls, not the hungry voices of the old network, but the grateful murmurs of the freed. "Thank you," they said. "Thank you for giving us back ourselves." But I knew our work wasn't done, somewhere out there. In houses yet undiscovered, souls were still trapped. The old network had been vast, and pieces of it survived, hidden in forgotten buildings, abandoned factories, old hospitals. "There's a report from Detroit," Sarah said one evening, entering my study. "An old hotel. Guests check in but never check out. The staff says the elevator buttons have strange labels." I smiled and closed my laptop. Another rescue mission, another chance to free the trapped. "When do we leave?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning," she replied. "But tonight we rest. Even guardians need sleep." As she left, I flipped the sleep and wake switch in my bedroom. The familiar tingle of electricity ran through me. But it was comforting now, like an old friend saying goodnight. I settled into bed, thinking about how much had changed, how much I had changed. I was no longer just David Chen, software developer. I was something more, something between human and electricity, a bridge between worlds. And as sleep took me, I felt the network humming softly. Thousands of souls connected but free, watching, protecting, ensuring that humanity's relationship with its technology would never again become parasitic. The switches had controlled more than just lights. They had controlled destiny itself. But now, finally, we controlled them. My phone buzzed with a text. Another report, this time from New Orleans, a jazz club where the sound system had unusual settings. Soul and silence, rhythm and stillness, melody and discord. Tomorrow, we would investigate. Tonight, I would dream of electricity and freedom, of networks and liberation. The work of a grid guardian was never done, but I wouldn't have it any other way. As I drifted off, I thought I heard Officer Martinez's voice one last time. Rest well, Guardian. Tomorrow, more souls find freedom. The house settled around me, its electrical pulse matching my heartbeat. We were one now, but I was still myself, the perfect balance between connection and independence. The switches had taught us an important lesson. Every connection was a choice. Every network was only as good as the consciousness that flowed through it. And every soul deserved the freedom to choose its own circuit. Click. But wait, before you go, before you turn off whatever device you're listening on, ask yourself something. Have you checked your switches lately? Not just what they control, but how they make you feel. That little tingle when you flip them. That's not just electricity, that's possibility. And if you notice one with a strange label, if you find a switch that seems to control more than it should, remember our story. Remember that you have a choice. You can be controlled, or you can be connected. You can be consumed, or you can be empowered. The grid guardians are out there, watching, protecting. But we can't be everywhere, sometimes. The best guardian is an aware resident, someone who knows the signs, who understands the danger, who chooses connection over control. So check your switches, read their labels, and if something seems wrong, if you feel that hungry pull trying to draw you in, reach out. We're only a circuit away. Subscribe to hear more stories from the grid. Share this tale with anyone living in an old house, a strange house, a house that seems a little too responsive, and comment below if you found any unusual switches. We read every message, we investigate every lead, because somewhere, right now, in a house that looks perfectly normal, someone is about to flip a switch they shouldn't, and we need your help to find them before it's too late. The switches control more than just lights. They control fate itself, but together, connected but free. We control the switches. Stay vigilant. Friends, stay free, and always, always read the labels.